Imagine walking through an apple orchard in late spring. The air is warm and carries something sweet in it. The faint smell of blossoms opening one by one along branches that were bare just weeks ago. Around you, the trees are alive in a way that goes beyond leaves and bark. There is movement everywhere. Small, deliberate, purposeful movement. If you stand still long enough and let your eyes adjust to the scale of it, you begin to see them. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Moving from flower to flower with a kind of focused efficiency that seems almost mechanical, except it isn't mechanical at all. It is ancient. It is biological. It is one of the most important things happening on Earth at this exact moment. You are watching bees work. It looks unremarkable. A small fuzzy body landing on a white petal, pausing for a fraction of a second, moving on, then another, then another. But what is happening in those tiny fractions of a second is nothing less than the transfer of life itself. Pollen from one flower is being carried to another. Fertilization is occurring. Seeds are being set. Fruit is beginning its long, slow journey from blossom to something you will eventually hold in your hand in a grocery store, or pick from a tree in a backyard, or slice open on a kitchen counter, without ever once thinking about the chain of events that made it possible. That chain runs through the bee. We talk about important species all the time. Wolves that reshape rivers by controlling deer populations. Elephants that dig water holes used by dozens of other animals. Whales that fertilize ocean surfaces with their nutrient-rich waste. Each of these is genuinely remarkable. Each plays a role that ripples outward through ecosystems in ways scientists are still working to fully understand. But bees occupy a category that is difficult to compare anything else to. They are not just important in the way that a keystone in an arch is important. They are important in the way that the arch itself is important. Remove them, and you're not just missing one piece. You're watching the whole structure consider collapsing. About 1/3 of all the food human beings eat depends, directly or indirectly, on pollination by bees. That number, when you sit with it, is extraordinary. It means that roughly every third bite of food you take exists because a bee landed on a flower somewhere in the world and carried pollen from one place to another. Almonds are almost entirely dependent on honeybee pollination. So are blueberries, cherries, avocados, and cucumbers. Apples, melons, squash, cranberries, onions, and many varieties of beans all rely heavily on bee activity to produce the yields that modern agriculture counts on. Without bees, these crops do not simply produce less. In many cases, they stop producing meaningful quantities altogether. But the story of bees is older and stranger, and more intricate than any single statistic can capture. These creatures have been on Earth for somewhere between 100 and 130 million years. They watched the dinosaurs. They were present when the first flowering plants evolved, and there is a deep and beautiful argument to be made that flowering plants and bees did not just coexist but co-created each other. That the diversity of flowers we see today, the dazzling variety of shapes and colours and scents, exists in large part because bees were selecting for it over millions of years of evolution, and that bees, in turn, became what they are because flowers shaped them. It is a relationship written in wings and petals over geological time. Tonight we are going to follow that story from its beginning to its uncertain present. We will look at what bees actually are, at the staggering complexity of how they live and think and communicate, at the way their presence or absence reshapes entire landscapes, and at what is happening to them right now, in fields and orchards and wild meadows across North America and the world. The science is extraordinary, the history is deep, and the questions it raises about the future are ones that no one, at the moment, can fully answer. So get comfortable, because we are going inside a world that is humming quietly and constantly, just at the edge of what most of us ever stop to notice. To understand why bees matter so much, you have to go back to a world that looks almost nothing like the one we know. A world without a single flower. For the first 3.5 billion years of life on Earth, flowering plants did not exist. The planet was covered in ferns, mosses, conifers and cycads, green and ancient and productive, but not flowering, not fruiting, not making the kind of seeds enclosed in nutrient-rich packages that would eventually become apples and plums and strawberries. The transformation, when it came, was dramatic enough that Charles Darwin called it an abominable mystery. In the fossil record, flowering plants appear suddenly and in great diversity during the Cretaceous period, roughly 130 million years ago. They spread with astonishing speed across the globe, and they brought with them something new in the history of life, a system of reproduction that relied on outsourcing. A flower is, at its core, a lure and a delivery mechanism. It produces nectar to attract visitors. It produces pollen, the male genetic material of the plant, and coats visiting animals with it. Those animals then carry that pollen to other flowers of the same species, completing a fertilization that the plant cannot manage on its own. Wind does some of this work, but wind is indiscriminate, wasteful, and unreliable over long distances. An animal that moves with purpose, that returns to the same species of flower again and again, is a far more efficient courier. The earliest bees evolved from a group of predatory wasps, probably around 100 million years ago, and the transition appears to have happened when some of those wasps shifted from hunting protein in the form of insects to collecting protein in the form of pollen. Pollen is extraordinarily nutritious. It is rich in proteins and fats and is an excellent food source, particularly for developing larvae. Once a wasp lineage made that shift, the feedback loop between insect and flower began turning. Bees that were better at finding and collecting pollen were more successful. Flowers that were better at attracting bees through colour, shape, or scent produced more offspring. Over millions of years, these two lineages shaped each other with exquisite precision. The results are everywhere you look if you know how to read them. The ultraviolet patterns on flower petals that are invisible to human eyes, but appear as vivid landing strips to bees. The tubular shape of certain flowers that matches almost perfectly the length of specific bee tongues. The timing of flower openings that coincides with the active periods of particular bee species. The way some orchids have evolved to mimic female bees so precisely that male bees attempt to mate with them, picking up pollen in the process. A deception so intricate it is difficult not to find it either wondrous or unsettling, depending on your mood. Bees did not evolve to serve us. They evolved alongside flowering plants across 100 million years, and the world that emerged from that partnership is the world that eventually made human agriculture possible. The fruits, seeds, and nuts that form the caloric and nutritional backbone of human diets exist because of a relationship that was already ancient, long before the first human being stood upright. There are approximately 20,000 known species of bees in the world. When most people think of bees, they picture the honeybee, that familiar striped insect living in hives, producing honey, the star of every childhood illustration involving flowers. But honeybees represent just a handful of species within that vast 20,000 member family. The rest are an astonishing array of solitary and semi-social creatures that most people have never heard of. Bumblebees, mason bees, leaf-cutter bees, mining bees, sweat bees, carpenter bees, each with its own body shape, its own behavioural toolkit, its own preferred flowers, its own nesting habits. Some are the size of a grain of rice. Others are over an inch long, some are brilliantly metallic green, others are pure black. Some nest in hollow stems, others excavate tunnels in bare soil, some are active in summer heat, others fly only in cool early spring before most flowers have opened. This diversity is not decorative, it is functional. Different bee species pollinate different plants. Some crops that receive virtually no attention from honeybees are serviced almost entirely by native wild bees. Wild bumblebees, for instance, are among the few insects that can perform a technique called buzz pollination, where they grip a flower and vibrate their flight muscles at a specific frequency to shake loose pollen that is otherwise inaccessible. Tomatoes, blueberries and cranberries depend heavily on this. A world with only honeybees would be a dramatically less productive agricultural world. A world with no bees at all is something most scientists prefer not to contemplate in detail, because the cascading consequences extend far beyond food production into the structural integrity of virtually every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. There is nothing quite like a honeybee colony when you try to understand what it actually is. A single hive contains somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 individual bees during peak summer months. That is not a crowd of individuals making individual decisions. It is something closer to a single distributed organism, a superorganism, making collective decisions through a process that researchers are still working to fully decode, and which turns out to be startlingly sophisticated. At the centre of the colony is the queen. She's the only sexually reproductive female in the hive, and her role is, in biological terms, singular. She can live for 3 to 5 years. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs per day at peak production. Over a lifetime, a single queen can produce hundreds of thousands of offspring. Her chemical signals, a suite of pheromones produced in glands throughout her body, regulate the behavior, physiology, and reproductive status of every other bee in the colony. When her pheromone output weakens with age, the colony begins preparing a replacement, raising new queens from fertilized eggs in specially constructed cells. When the new queens hatch, competition between them can be swift and brutal. The first to emerge often kills her rivals before they can emerge from their cells. The workers, which make up the overwhelming majority of the hive, are all female. They live for approximately 6 weeks during the summer, working continuously, and their tasks shift over the course of their short lives in a progression that is not random. Young bees, newly emerged, begin as nurses, feeding larvae and tending brood cells in the warm interior of the hive. As they age, their wax glands develop, and they transition to construction work, building and maintaining the hexagonal comb that is one of the most structurally efficient shapes known to engineering. Honeycomb, with its precisely angled walls and consistent cell dimensions, uses the minimum amount of material to create the maximum amount of storage space. Bees did not learn this through mathematics. Evolution arrived at it through 100 million years of trial and error, and it produces a structure that engineers today still reference when designing lightweight load-bearing materials. As workers age further, they take on roles involving food processing and hive defense, and eventually transition to foraging outside the hive, the role most visible to human observers. It is the forager bees that visit flowers, collect nectar and pollen, and return to the hive. A single forager will visit somewhere between 50 and 100 flowers on each trip, and may make up to 10 trips per day. To produce a single pound of honey, bees collectively fly the equivalent of twice around the Earth and visit approximately 2 million flowers. Honey itself is not accidental, it is engineered food storage. Bees collect nectar, which is mostly water with dissolved sugars, then reduce its water content through evaporation inside the hive, fanning it with their wings until it reaches a concentration stable enough not to ferment, then seal it with wax for long-term preservation. That dense, shelf-stable, antimicrobial food cache is what allows a colony to survive winter when no flowers are blooming and no new food is available. But perhaps the most astonishing thing bees do is talk. In 1944, Austrian biologist Karl von Frisch made one of the most celebrated discoveries in the history of animal behavior. He demonstrated that honeybees communicate the location of food sources to their hive mates through movement. Not through chemical signals alone, not through sound, but through a precise, information-rich dance performed on the vertical surface of the comb inside the dark hive. He called it the waggle dance, and it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable things any non-human animal is known to do. A returning forager that has found a rich food source will perform a figure-8 movement of the comb surface. The central straight segment of the figure-8, the waggle run, encodes the direction and distance of the food. The angle of the waggle run relative to vertical corresponds to the angle of the food source relative to the sun. The duration of the waggle run corresponds to distance. A 2-second waggle run means the food is roughly 1 kilometre away. A 4-second run indicates about 4 kilometres. The vigour of the dance and the number of circuits the bee completes communicate the quality of the source. Other bees follow the dancer, touching her with their antennae, reading the dance, and then flying out to the precise location she has described. This is symbolic communication. It is the displacement of information about a location in space and time. The dancing bee is not at the food source. She is describing it, telling other bees about something that exists elsewhere. For a very long time, this was considered one of the defining features separating human language from animal communication. Bees complicated that boundary considerably. Recent research has added more layers of complexity to the picture. Studies published in the 2020s confirmed that young bees learned the waggle dance by following experienced dancers, not purely by instinct, suggesting a form of cultural transmission. Bees raised in isolation produce a cruder, less accurate version of the dance. Bees that learn from experienced foragers produce more precise dances earlier in their careers. The dance, in other words, is not simply hardwired. It is, in some meaningful sense, taught. To understand what bees do to the world around them, it helps to think not about individual flowers or individual hives, but about entire landscapes stretched across centuries. In the American West, there are meadows filled with wildflowers that look, to an untrained eye, like the natural state of things. Lupine and monkey flower and wild geraniums spreading across hillsides in patterns that seem casual, unplanned. But those patterns are not random. They are the accumulated result of millions of bee visits over hundreds of years, of which plants got pollinated and produced seed, and whose offspring survived to flower again next season. Bees are not merely visiting a landscape. They are, in a deep sense, authoring it. This is most visible when you study areas where wild bee populations have declined and compare them to areas where they remain robust. The differences in plant diversity are striking. Fewer bees mean fewer plant species successfully reproducing. Fewer plant species mean fewer insects that depend on those specific plants. Fewer insects mean fewer birds that eat those insects. The cascade continues outward until what began as a change in bee populations has rearranged the entire biological community of a place. Scientists have a term for this. They call it a trophic cascade, the rippling effect of a change at one level of an ecosystem through all the levels connected to it. Bees sit at a peculiar and powerful position in these cascades. They are not predators at the top of a food chain. They are pollinators in the middle of an incredibly complex web of relationships, and their influence radiates outward in so many directions simultaneously that quantifying the total economic and ecological value of bee pollination becomes an exercise that produces numbers almost too large to hold comfortably in mind. The most widely cited estimates suggest that pollinators, with bees contributing the majority of that service, provide somewhere between $235 and $577 billion in annual economic value to global food production. Some more recent assessments place the figure higher. The range is large because the calculation is genuinely complicated. You have to account for not just the crops that fail completely without bee pollination, but the reduced yields, the lower nutritional quality, the secondary effects on livestock and fisheries that depend on pollination-dependent plants further up the food chain. Beyond the economic frame, which is itself a strange and reductive way to measure something that shapes the basic structure of living landscapes. Bees contribute to processes that no dollar figure can adequately capture. The forests of the eastern United States include dozens of tree species that rely on bee pollination. The berry-producing shrubs that feed bears, birds, and dozens of other species through the critical months before winter. The wildflower meadows that provide habitat for hundreds of butterfly and moth species. The native grasses pollinated by specialist bees, whose ranges have become less beautiful. It begins to lose the functional redundancy that makes it resilient. When one plant species declines, others can fill the gap, but only if the pollinators that service those alternatives are present. A forest stripped of its pollinator diversity is a forest that has lost much of its ability to recover from disturbance. There is also something worth understanding about the relationship between wild bees and the land that is more intimate than any economic or ecological accounting can capture. Wild solitary bees, the ones that nest in bare soil patches or hollow plant stems, or the pithy centres of cut bramble canes, are exquisitely sensitive indicators of landscape health. A meadow that supports a diverse population of wild bees is almost by definition a meadow with high plant diversity, stable soil structure, minimal pesticide contamination, and sufficient areas of undisturbed ground for nesting. Where wild bees thrive, ecosystems tend to be functioning well across multiple dimensions at once. They are, in a meaningful sense, a living measure of the health of a place. Somewhere in the American Midwest in late winter of 2006, a beekeeper opened his hives and found them nearly empty. Not robbed by another colony, not killed by a visible pathogen, just gone. The adult bees had vanished, leaving behind capped honey and capped brood and a queen with a small cluster of attendants, but no forager workforce, no returning bees, no dead bodies at the hive entrance, just absence. He reported it to researchers at the University of Florida. Within months, similar reports were flooding in from beekeepers across the country. By the spring of 2007, it was clear that something was happening on a scale that the beekeeping industry had never encountered. In some apiaries, losses exceeded 90%. Colonies that had been healthy in the fall were essentially gone by spring. Scientists gave it a name that captured its most baffling characteristic: colony collapse disorder. More than 15 years later, there is still no single confirmed cause for colony collapse disorder. That fact alone tells you something important about how complex the situation is. Researchers have identified a range of factors that appear to contribute, some more than others in different circumstances, but no single smoking gun that explains all the cases or provides a clear path to a solution. Varroa destructor, a parasitic mite originally from Asian honeybee populations, is widely considered the most significant single threat to managed honeybee colonies in the United States. The mite attaches to bees and feeds on a fatty organ called the fat body, weakening immune function and shortening lifespan. More critically, it serves as a vector for a suite of viruses, including deformed wing virus, which causes developmental abnormalities in pupae and reduces the cognitive function of adult bees that survive infection. A hive with a heavy Varroa load is a hive under simultaneous assault from parasitism, viral disease, and compromised immune response. Beekeepers manage Varroa with chemical treatments, but the mite has developed resistance to several of the available options, and the management burden is significant and continuous. Pesticides are the second major factor, and the story here is more complicated than it might initially appear. Neonicotinoids, a class of systemic insecticides that became widely used in agriculture beginning in the 1990s, are applied as seed coatings or soil treatments and are absorbed into all tissues of the growing plant, including pollen and nectar. Studies have shown that even sublethal doses of neonicotinoids impair bee navigation and memory, reduce colony reproduction, interfere with the waggle dance, and make bees more vulnerable to other stressors including Varroa mites and pathogens. The European Union banned the outdoor use of the three most common neonicotinoids in 2018. Regulatory action in the United States has been slower and more contested. Habitat loss is the third leg of the stool, and it affects wild native bees even more than it affects managed honeybees. As grasslands are converted to monoculture cropland, as roadsides are mowed on schedules that eliminate flowering plants before they can set seed, as suburban development replaces the complex mosaic of habitats, that support diverse bee communities with lawns and pavement, the resource base for wild bees' contracts. A bumblebee queen emerging from winter hibernation needs early blooming flowers within a short flight radius of her nest site. If the landscape around her has been tidied into a floral desert, she may not survive long enough to establish a colony. The loss of a single queen in that situation is the loss of a potential colony of several hundred workers that might have pollinated thousands of flowers over the course of a summer. The numbers from monitoring programs are sobering. North American bumblebee populations have declined dramatically since the 1990s. The rusty-patched bumblebee, once one of the most common species in the eastern United States, has lost approximately 87% of its historical range and was listed as endangered in 2017, becoming the first bee species in the continental United States to receive federal endangered species protection. At least a quarter of all native North American bee species are considered to be in decline. Some researchers believe the true number is higher because the baseline data for many species is so sparse that detecting trends is difficult. There is a strange and uncomfortable irony embedded in this situation. The world that bees built over 100 million years of evolution is now largely administered by human beings. The forests have been cleared, the meadows ploughed, the riversides paved, the seed coatings applied, and the bees that made that agricultural world possible are struggling to survive within it. On a hillside in rural Pennsylvania, a woman is planting borage along the edge of her vegetable garden. It is a small act, the kind that does not make headlines. Borage produces star-shaped blue flowers that bloom continuously through the summer and produce abundant nectar. Bumblebees are drawn to it reliably, specifically, with a preference that sometimes feels almost like affection. She has been planting it for 7 years, ever since she noticed that the garden had grown quieter, that the hum she remembered from childhood summers had become sporadic, irregular, something she noticed now precisely because of its absence. She also leaves a corner of her yard unmowed until midsummer, allowing the dandelions and clover to flower before the blade comes through. She has a small pile of hollow bamboo canes propped in a sunny spot near the fence, a homemade mason bee hotel of the kind that has become familiar in garden centres across the country. On good mornings in June, she counts the bees visiting the barrage. The numbers have improved since she started. Not dramatically, but enough. Multiply that kind of effort across hundreds of thousands of yards and farms and highway roadsides and urban parks, and you begin to see the shape of what researchers call landscape-scale restoration. Individual patches of habitat are not in themselves sufficient for most species, but connected corridors of diverse flowering plants, undisturbed nesting sites, and reduced pesticide use can together create conditions in which bee populations recover. Several cities in the United States and Europe have begun programs to convert portions of public land from mowed grass to wildflower meadows. The results from monitoring programs in cities like London, Amsterdam, and Minneapolis have been encouraging, showing meaningful increases in both bee diversity and abundance in areas where habitat restoration has been prioritized. On the agricultural side, the picture is more complicated and more contested. Large-scale monoculture farming is fundamentally in tension with the needs of diverse pollinator communities. A landscape of wall-to-wall corn and soybeans, both wind-pollinated and therefore requiring no bee service, offers nothing to bees except exposure to pesticides and an absence of food. The fields that surround that corn and those soybeans, the orchards, the berry farms, the vegetable operations, do need bees, but they depend on bee populations that are sustained by habitat that exists somewhere outside the crop fields themselves. The economic logic of modern agriculture has steadily reduced that habitat, and the consequences for wild bee populations have followed with a kind of grim predictability. Some farmers are beginning to change this calculus, planting pollinator strips along field edges, reducing pesticide applications during flowering periods, leaving hedgerows intact. Certification programs and market incentives are slowly building a business case for practices that support pollinators. Federal programs in the United States, including provisions in successive farm bills, have directed money toward pollinator habitat on agricultural land. Conservation organizations have worked with landowners to restore milkweed and native wildflower populations on millions of acres. These are real changes. They are not yet changes at the scale that the biology demands. The science of bee cognition has developed in parallel with the science of bee decline, and this pairing carries an ethical weight that is easy to sidestep but difficult to entirely ignore. We now know that bees are not simply biological mechanisms executing pre-programmed responses. They learn, they remember, they communicate complex spatial information. They demonstrate something that researchers carefully describe as pessimistic cognitive bias under stressful conditions, a state that has measurable parallels to what we call anxiety in mammals. A bee exposed to chronic sublethal pesticide doses does not just fly less efficiently. Something changes in how she processes the world. That finding will mean different things to different people. For some it will be philosophically unimportant, a curious data point but not a reason to reconsider how we treat insects. For others it will add a dimension to the conversation about bees that goes beyond food security and economic value, a dimension that touches the question of what it means to share a planet with other living things, and what obligations, if any, that sharing entails. What seems clear, regardless of where one lands on those deeper questions, is that bees are not a background detail of the natural world. They are not a nice-to-have feature of summer afternoons and wildflower photographs. They are a foundational process, as fundamental to the structure of terrestrial life as photosynthesis, as nutrient cycling, as the water cycle itself. The forests and fields and orchards of North America, and of every other continent where flowering plants grow, are partially the product of what bees have been doing, flower by flower and generation by generation, since before the first mammal walked the earth. We did not invent the food system that bees make possible. We inherited it. Every apple orchard and blueberry farm and almond grove we manage is built on top of a much older system that requires no management, no tending, no human intelligence to operate. It only requires that we leave enough of the world intact for the bees to do what they have always done. Whether we choose to do that, in the face of the economic pressures and agricultural structures and policy frameworks that currently make it difficult, is a question that is still open. The answer will not be written in ice cores or sediment layers or ancient pollen. It will be written in the landscapes we choose to build or unmake in the coming decades, and in whether those landscapes, when late spring arrives, still hum. That hum, quiet and constant and easy to miss in the noise of everything else, is one of the oldest sounds on Earth. It was here before the first flower opened, in the form of the wasps that would eventually become bees. It has accompanied every season of the planet's warm periods for 100 million years. It underlies virtually every meal you have ever eaten. If you want to hear it, go outside on a warm morning in June and stand near something blooming. Stand still. Let the scale of it settle. One bee, one flower, one small transfer of pollen. Multiply that by 1 trillion, by 100 million years, and you begin to approach something like an accurate sense of what you're listening to. For now, though, let the hum continue in the background of wherever you are. The bees will be at work again tomorrow. The flowers will open again with the light, and the ancient, unhurried conversation between them will go on, as it has always gone on whether we are paying attention or not.